to say Nowruz Mubarak to everyone. It's the beginning of a spring, hopefully the beginning of a new season in our lives. And I want to say a special thank you to Professor Zeynep Oktay Oslu, who was in contact with me, and we organized, planned this talk. It's an absolute pleasure for me to be speaking with you today. I was just before the starting of the program telling my Turkish colleagues that I am so overjoyed to be speaking in a Turkish institution as high standard in scholarship as Boğaziçi for the past half a century. And that it would be about Mevlana and a treasure that we share closely. So let me say again that Boğaziçi is in our minds and hearts. We really appreciate the love and support that you give to maintain the standard of scholarship in this venerable institution. I also have personal, special connections with Boğaziçi in that my husband, Ahmet Kara Mustafa, went to Robert College. Maybe he was one of the last, I think, of people graduating from Robert College, which later on became Boğaziçi University. And also our daughter, Ayla, chose Boğaziçi for a semester abroad and spent a semester in Boğaziçi and loved every minute of it. So much so that she took us there again on one trip to just show us the spots that she spent time on, and really felt that was a life-changing experience for her. So on those notes, I'm absolutely delighted to be speaking about Maulana's global presence today. And I think it's very clear to everyone that that doesn't fit in under an hour talk. And even though my experience already limits it mostly to English-speaking parts of the world, it still is a huge body of literature to look at. And I'm delighted, first of all, not to have to go through biographical details of Rumi's life and really focus on his presence and on his global role in this learned audience that already knows Jalaluddin Rumi, or Maulana as Iranians call him, or Mevlana as Turks call him. It's all the same. So I would like to just spend a couple of minutes on the angle that I want you to be aware of. The angles used basically to see Rumi, mostly in English-speaking parts of the world. And by way of an example, I want to say that as a young literary critic, many years ago, when I discovered that Edward Fitzgerald translated Omar Khayyam mostly to address the Victorian society and criticize their very rigid norms, that it was much more about Edward Fitzgerald and about the Victorian society than it was really about Omar Khayyam. That had a kind of an eye-opening experience. So that very much applies to the way basically Rumi is present right now in English-speaking parts of the world globally, and even in other non-speaking English parts of the world. So the prism used there, the channel through which he is viewed, is, I'm afraid, still an Orientalist prism. Now, we are all aware that the great Orientalists, those people with impressive philological prowess and your kind of encyclopedic mind, are not there exactly in the same way, and things have changed. But in some ways, the Orientalizing process is still alive and well. It really, there's no point in doing any history of that, as I want to really focus on Maulana himself, but it's important to remember that somewhere between the 18th to even the first decades of the 20th century, maybe even up to the 20th century, basically the Muslim world was viewed as bound by a set of changeless religious doctrines, and kind of still as the other, opposing a European civilization. Sufism was mostly viewed as exotic, peculiar, kind of deluded followers of Plato, kind of that were dealing with these principles. Just one example, Alexander Pope wrote, "The Eastern priests who in giddy circles turn their heads to imitate the sun." So it was mostly, I know that I am moving very fast through this. There is much more nuance there, but unfortunately, a lot of this perspective was there and was very powerful. Now, after a few more scholars emerged with, among the Orientalists, with deeper understanding of Sufism, then that changed a little bit, but it's still very ahistorical. Basically, the Sufis in the second wave were free-thinking beings who wanted to break out of this rigid tradition that ruled over Muslim mind and Muslim societies. I personally was present in a talk where Houston Smith, viewed as one of the major scholars of world wisdom traditions, said, and I quote, "If it were not for Sufis, we could never communicate with Muslims." And that statement really blew my mind. How could you not see the rest of the society? Now, of course, that wasn't everybody, but the shades of that are still there, as I'm going to refer to when we have examples. But then something else happened, and some other Orientalists discovered classical literatures of these parts of the world. In this case, Persian classical literature. And the complexity, the subtlety, the depth totally blew their minds. So this couldn't be just a crazy dervish or just even a simple free-thinking being. It was something more. There was something more to it than that. And they began to translate and read more of that, but still the basic principles hardly have gone away, maybe among the scholars in the past few decades. And therefore, Orientalizing Maulana is very much a part and parcel of the reception he receives in the 21st century. In some ways, actually, in a funny way, it's sometimes self-orientalizing. Like you see translators or scholars coming from that part of the world highlighting and celebrating this ahistorical, absolutely detached from context being, because that's easier to accept, is easier to live with. You won't believe this, I sometimes give talks and it is a simple, innocent question. آیا واقعاً مولانا مسلمان بود? Was he really a Muslim? So this free thinker is seen as anti-tradition, anti-practice, anti-religion, and certainly anti-Islam in many, many places. Something that contributes to this are the existing translations that happen either by people who don't even know the language or know it in a very rudimentary level. Give you an example. Rumi, in a very beautiful ghazal, which I will read later in the talk, says, هر که ز حور پرسدت رخ بنما که همچنین. هر که ز ماه پرسدت بام برآ که همچنین. If anybody asks you about houris, show your face, say like this. And if anybody asks you about the moon, just climb up on the roof and say like this. Now, Coleman Barks, who's I'm sure known to many of you, translates هر که ز حور پرسدت رخ بنما که همچنین. He takes out the word huri, that's too tainted by Islam, and he says, if everyone asks you about perfect sexual satisfaction, show your face, say like this. Now, I don't want to say that huris are asexual in any way. Of the kind of things that the kind of facelift that has been given to Maulana in order to become a 21st century Western presence. Now, within this way of thinking, there's conflict and contradiction as well. So everybody is not the same. In the New Age California way of thinking about him, everything he says is a balm for every social and personal ailment. It can cure you of everything. And if you pay $25 an hour and learn how to whirl, that will be even more effective. So that could happen there. But then at the same time, you would meet some young people who have grown up here, but they are connected either with Turkey or Iran or some Arab culture, and they would genuinely tell you, do we really focus on Rumi when these other people are building, you know, the most sophisticated technological instruments and make progress, and we have to be left behind. So that, again, a historical contrast between tradition and modernity, and him embodying the tradition for them, for this particular group of readers is very important. Some even see it as a Western conspiracy. They made him so great so that they don't have to see the rest of us. So just to give you a background of receiving Maulana, what has been really much more of a issue for those of us who work in scholarship is the failing of the scholars who worked on Rumi up until very, very recently. And I don't want to name people because there are scholars who've done good work as well, but some of them have even gone as far as saying, as a good Muslim, he hated poetry. He didn't want to write poetry, but he had to, because he had these inner surges of spiritual emotions that he had to write it. And their explanation is that the Quran says, the poets follow those who've gone astray. Of course, anybody who knows anything about the multiple civilizations in the Muslim background, Muslim majority societies, knows that poetry has been a major artifact produced that has paid, that has had great impact on their lives. And of course, the Masnavi is okay. The Masnavi, the compendium of mystical conceptualization and mystical knowledge, that's fine. He's a towering mystic, he could have written that. But when it comes to lyric poetry, full of life, full of play, he's sometimes a lover, another time is a footless runner like the moon. می شدم در فنا چو مه بی پا اینت بی پا ی پا دوان که منم. I was traveling, I was journeying in the darkness of annihilation like the moon in a dark night. And another time he's lost, another time he's a mischievous child. So this was too much play to accept until fairly recently. In fact, I wrote my book on Rumi, to which Professor Octavius referred in 1995 on the divan, just to say, for God's sake, he's a great poet. Read this poetry and try to understand him as a poet. You don't want to, this doesn't mean you have to exclude the fact that he's a towering mystic. But now, of course, things have changed much more. But let me give you an example of things that he could give that would be shocking to people. Because he gets in it, he gets pregnant in it, or he breastfeeds puppies. It's just an amazing range of play. روز باران است و ما جو میکنیم، بر امید وصل دستی میزنیم. ابرها آبستن از دریای عشق، ما ز ابر عشق خود آبستنیم. It is a rainy day, I dig a canal. In the hope of union, I clap my hands. The clouds are pregnant with drops from the sea of love. I am pregnant with those clouds. تو مگو مطرب نیم، دستی بزن. تو بیا ما خود تو را مطرب کنیم. روشن است آن خانه گویی آن کیست. ما غلام خانه های روشنی. Don't say I'm not a musician. Come and clap your hand. I'll make you into a musician. So bright, those houses, who do they belong to? I love bright houses so. So this could honestly be a poem that a 21st century poet in your neighborhood writes about love, about the clouds raining that love, about being pregnant with life. And then another aspect to this playful existence that makes him really accessible in the time we live in is that the body and the soul are not seen as conflicting. Yes, the soul is the exalted. I don't think you can claim that he sees them on completely the same level. But they are part and parcel of the same human continuum of experience. Cannot detach them from each other. Now, the poem that I quoted a little bit from, هر که ز حور پرسدت رخ بنما که همچنین. هر که ز ماه پرسدت بام برآ که همچنین. هر که پری طلب کند چهره خود بدو نما. هر که ز مشک پرسدت زلف گشا که همچنین. هر که بپرسدت ز مه ابر چگونه وا شود. باز گشا گره گره بند قبا که همچنین. If anyone asks you about the Houris, show your face. Say like this. If anyone asks you about the moon, climb up on the roof. Say like this. If anyone seeks a fairy, let them see your countenance. If anyone talks about the aroma of musk, untie your hair. Say like this. If anyone asks, how do the clouds uncover the moon? Untie the front of your robe, knot by knot. Say like this. If anyone asks, how did Jesus raise the dead? Kiss me on the soul. Say like this. If anyone asks, what are those killed by love like? Direct them to me. Say like this. Now, admittedly, he ends the ghazal by saying, Kuriye anke cannot see it, contrary to what a person cannot see, and say that human beings cannot reach God. give us each a candle of purity. در کف هر یکی بنه شمع صفا که همچنین. Give us each a candle of purity and say like this. In other words, the doors open, you exist in body and soul, and you just need to understand and acknowledge them and move forward. Now, if you were if you ask me what would be a good way to say what he does to poetry, which is so accessible in our time, I will refer you to something he did, or at least according to Aflaki he did, after the death of Salahuddin Zarqub, his beloved disciple. So as they were carrying, you might know the story already, as they were carrying the body of Salahuddin Zarqub to bury him, Rumi stopped the funeral procession and said, take the instruments out. And they moved the rest of the way, whirling and dancing, and took him there. So I think it's a very apt metaphor that what he did with poetry, which was great and robust and full of amazing traditions, existing already traditions, he turned that funeral into a violin dance. He opened the doors. He basically said that poetry is about a creative mode of engaging your life in it with all its daily challenges. Now, if you think at a general understanding of lyric poetry, Fry writes, for example, that a lyric poet is sitting with his face to the wall and is talking to himself. All we hear is, if we leave the door open a little bit, we can hear it. In other words, lyric poets just talk to themselves and talk to some beloved who's not present there. Well, not Rumi. He's dynamic, he's down to earth, he's direct, and he's dramatic. And I'm going to specifically emphasize dramatic. Almost always he's on a stage talking to you. You know, some line that really shocked me at some point was that he says, I am talking about two kinds of birds. Which one are you, my reader? So you have to stop. You kind of stumble on that. You have to stop and give up the role of this passive readership and engage with him within or outside the poetry. For he himself, it is an imaginative struggle with language. And I'm borrowing this phrase from Detweiler, who wrote on translation and on basically interpretation of ideas and expressions of them, that the intricacy of language for him was a tool to look at sides of things and aspects of things that we could easily miss. Because language could also be very transparent. So when you ask someone to open the door, please, that nobody is aware of that language. Nobody thinks, oh my God, you know, door, what a beautiful word. No, that language, referential language is transparent. But poets make you see this language and see what a tool it can be in your life. And I believe that we can show that Maulana is really one of the masters of this art. And, you know, he's very aware of it. That's why it's sometimes shocking when people, you know, of course he says in a ghazal, muftailon, 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 kosht mara. I'm tired of this rhyming and meter and all that. But that was the surface. He didn't want to have, of course, to deal with that. But Sokhan, that tool of creative engagement and creative struggle, that was very valuable for him. And of course, it was a coin with two sides. The other side was silence. I'm not going to go into silence, but I have a whole chapter on that in the book on him, because the silence is equally pregnant for him and equally imaginative, but we can't really focus on that. Let's just stay on Sohan. He's very aware of the power of speech. He says, in fact, as on میرنجم که سخن منقاد من نمیشود. Sometimes I'm offended by language because it doesn't lend itself to my control. Another time he says, شعر من نان مصر را ماند. My poetry, my words are Egyptian bread. Eat them fresh, eat them warm. So eat them in the context in which they were created. And of course, that brings to mind that diversity of languages that he was exposed to, you know, Arabic, Turkish, Greek, Persian. This was a world in which he lived, and therefore he writes the story of grapes, where someone gives a small amount of money to four people, and a Persian, an Arab, a Greek, and a Turk, and در تنازع آن نفر جنگی شدند که ز سر نامها غافل بودند. Now, the Persian said, I want to buy angur. The Turk said, no, let's buy some uzum. The Greek said, let's get estafil. And the Arab said, you're all wrong, let's get anab. And then they got into a fight. But the point that he's making is صاحب سری عزیزی صد زبان گر بودی آنجا بدادی صلحشان. If this beloved, rare person of 100 languages, عزیزی صد زبان, was there, that person could tell them that they are all asking for the same thing, that they don't need to fight each other, and they can all benefit from it. Now, I don't think that he's expressing this in a rather simple kind of United Nations way, let's all come together and talk to each other and solve our problems. But he wants to again say that language is about that creative struggle, about understanding the meaning of life, about what makes us unhappy and what makes us happy. And therefore, this Sohan for him is highly affective. It carries human emotion in ways that other vehicles, or music maybe comes close, he talks about that too. But then that affective, emotional aspect of it makes connections that are unusual. ای بسا هندو و ترک همزبان، ای بسا دو ترک چون بیگاه بگن. So many Turks and Hindus are speaking the same language, and there are those Turks who do not speak the same language. In other words, this goes beyond the dictionary equivalence of words and opens it up to what he later on defines as زبان محرمی, or the language of companionship, or the language that allows you to be who you are, because it's with mahram that you can be who you are. Now, his understanding of language is also highly sophisticated. I really am hoping and praying that I get to a point where I can do some work on his mastery of understanding of language. You know, he says at some point, he says, سبو به دست دویدم به جویبار معانی که آب گشت سبویم چو آب جان به سبو شد. I ran to the stream of meaning with my jug or jar, depending on which one. In the water of life, meaning came in, my jar was itself water. This is Derrida for you, you know, the difference between content and meaning or form, content and form, is superficial, is a bifocality that we have developed because understanding that form itself is meaning, and meaning is what shapes the word, has been far too sophisticated for people to think about until fairly recently. And as you see, he does express that quite readily and is aware of it. And I want to, again, before moving on to something else, again, highlight that this complexity and diversity of speech for him undoubtedly translates itself into the size and diversity of people. Now, I don't want to suggest that he had no biases, that he was an ahistorical being, that, you know, he obviously had a very panoramic vision of the world, but he was like everybody else, a person of his time. And it is possible to sometimes see that he's not quite the feminist we want him to be, or, you know, in parallel situations with other, you know, markers of privilege in society. Although he's way, way beyond the time, and of course, even for our times sometimes. But I remember I was actually not so long ago, maybe about 4 or 5 months ago, I was invited to a program on BBC4 that was about Dante. It was about Dante's Inferno, but they wanted to somehow draw parallels between Dante and Rumi. And it wasn't possible to do that. Dante didn't travel the way Rumi did. He didn't see megacities like Samarkand and Bukhara and Baghdad. He didn't study in Aleppo. He didn't hear Persian, Turkish, Arabic, and Greek. So it wasn't surprising that he created, in his Inferno, there are these complete others that don't seem to be worthy of the kind of reality that he wants to share with everyone. Now, in honesty and justice to Dante, he also bypasses or kind of transgresses in some ways the border lines of his time. But there is just absolutely no comparison. And that in part is because of the cosmopolitan existence that Rumi has had, with, not to, of course, even mention his father, Baha'u'llah, or his teacher, Burhanuddin Muhammad Tirmizi, and the presence of other giant figures like Sadruddin Ghunavi and others in his time that have all had impacts on his way of thinking. So the product we're dealing with is really as cosmopolitan as anybody can be. And there's no surprise that he talks about Nimi, the Turkestan, Nimi, the Farghane. Part of me is from Turkestan and the other from Farghana. And of course, he refers to Khorasan, he refers to other parts of the world where he has seen or read about. We also see that he's, some of the stories he focuses on come from the Indian tradition, come from other traditions. So this openness to read other people's literature has also something to do with a diversity that kind of makes it okay to have a difference of opinion. Now, if you again look at this orientalized version of him, he wants to turn the tradition upside down. He is just hates the tradition that binds him. He wants to break it all up. And I think there's nothing further from the truth. I believe that he was genuinely and deeply dedicated to upholding the tradition in which he lived and practiced. And he loved it so much that he wanted to better it by exploring it and seeing aspects of it that others hadn't seen. Now, there is actually a 20th century literary critic, Alistair Fowler. I'm sure many of you are familiar with his work. He has a book which he wrote in late 60s called The Kinds of Literature. And it's up to this day, it's still a classic. And Fowler makes a fascinating point. He says you cannot reform a tradition unless you are deeply in love with it. Because it's only then that you can actually break the rules, because you know which rules to break and which rules to uphold. And that is exactly what Maulana does time and again. You see him using a very traditional format and then suddenly comes up with something that shocks you. And that applies to his understanding of being a Muslim, an understanding of Islam. There is an episode that Aflaki again tells us about, that apparently Maulana was speaking in the house of Muinuddin Parwane, the major governor of the city of Pune. And Rumi said in this, he said, Al-Mu'minuna la yamutun. The believers, the actual believers don't die. Yungaluna min ad-dar ila ad-dar. They kind of move from house to house. And there was this learned scholar of religion there who said, then why does God Almighty say, Kulla nafsin za'iqat al-maut? Why does God say every nafs experiences death? And Rumi, according to Aflaki, without missing a beat, says, Akhar goft kulla nafsin. Akhar goft kulla nafsin, nagoft kulla qalbin. He said, every nafs dies, not every heart. Get yourself a heart, and then you won't die. So that was a kind of a answering on the spot, but he did far more deep and well-planned and premeditated, that's the word I was looking for, premeditated readings of the Quran when he talked with people. You know, there's a famous Quranic verse, نَحْنُ نَزَّلْنَا الذِّكْرَ وَنَحْنُ لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ, that in the Quran, according to the belief of the Muslims, God says, we have sent you the zikr, and we are its protector, the royal we, God. And invariably, every commentator on the Quran has interpreted zikr as the Quran itself. But that's partly because the Quran refers to itself as zikr and says, Hadha zikr, this is remembrance. But also because the continuation of the sentence is, وَنَحْنُ لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ, and we will protect it. And that gives a sense of certitude to the Muslim believer that the Quran is therefore unadulterated, it's protected in its most genuine form. So Rumi is talking, so he quotes this verse. And then he says, مفسران گفتند که این در حق قرآن است. Commentators say this zikr here refers to Quran. In Nikus, that's fine. Amma in these hast. But there is this interpretation too. And he already here is telling them you can reinterpret. You don't have to just stick to what everybody said. So in Nikus, that's fine. اما این نیز هست که ما در تو شوقی و طلبی نهاده ایم و حافظ آن مایی. So God is saying, according to Rumi, we have put in you the zikr, the shawq, the talab, the yearning, and we will protect that. So with that, not only the word zikr, the borderlines open up and become a property of people, become the property of everyone. He doesn't say Muslims. He says, Darto, you, we have placed this yearning, this quest, and we are going to protect it. So using the Quran, he's opening the door to a new way of reading the Quran itself. Now, I'm aware that I'm getting close, and so I want to just make a couple more points. One is that this awareness of change, awareness, this permission to see things fresh, has really foundational, structural impact on his way of thinking. And I did a little study. Of course, the lyric poetries are 35,000 verses. So nowadays you can do computational, all kinds of counting words and concepts. But at the time, I just was making notes on a little word processor on the word shodan. Now, shodan in Persian means to become, but it also, as an auxiliary, it means turning something into something else. Bozorg shodan, to grow older, or I don't want to say kuchek shodan, because then that has a psychological meaning of losing your personality, but sart shodan, to cool something down. And his use of that verb is the highest of all the verbs that he uses in that volume that I looked at. And it's often about the change of seasons, the change of humanity, moving from one stage to another. مرده بودم زنده شدم، گریه بودم خنده شدم، دولت عشق آمد و من دولت پاینده شدم. دیده سیر است مرا، جان دلیر است مرا، زهره شیر است مرا، زهره تابنده شدم. گفت که دیوانه نی، لایق این خانه نی، رفتم و دیوانه شدم، سلسله بندنده شدم. گفت که تو مست نی، رو که از این دست نی، رفتم و سرمست شدم و از طرب آکنده شدم. I was dead, I came to life. I was a cry, I turned into laughter. The fortune of love fell upon me, and I turned into everlasting fortune myself. I no longer crave things, and my soul is brave, brave as a lion and bright like a star. He said, "You're not crazy. You do not deserve to live in this house." I became crazy. I put myself in chains. He said, "You're not drunk enough. Give up this pretense. You're not the right type." I became drunk. I became full of enchantment. So this process of becoming is almost a non-ending process in the divan, in the lyric poems, which have really been the focus of my presentation today, even though I have made quotes from the Masnavi. And I actually want to end this by saying that all of the different constituent components of this complex poetic whole that you see tells you something important about life, which I think he expresses in multiple ways. And that is knowledge, and knowing is partial and it's perspectival. Nobody owns the whole knowledge. Nobody is free of having a vantage point. And therefore, his understanding of knowledge is truly sophisticated. An example of it is the story of the elephant in the dark, where people for the first time had an elephant in town. It was in a house, it was night, but they still were curious, wanted to go in and see what the elephant looked like. And the next day, when people asked them, well, what does the elephant look like? Those who had touched the feet of the elephant said, an elephant is like a big, thick column. And those who had touched its ears said, well, no, actually an elephant looks like a fan. And those who had been taller and had been able to touch the body and maybe the higher part of the elephant's back, they said, it looks like a throne. It's something you can sit on. So, and then at that point, Rumi says, در کف هر یک اگر شمعی بودی اختلاف از گفتشان بیرون شدی. If they could bring a candle, but they would still be bound by perspective, but they would at least see that what they can see is much larger than they are able to claim knowledge, full knowledge of or control of. And of course, this is a story he borrows from the Indian tradition, which I'm absolutely sure had great thinkers who had the same level of sophistication. So on this note, I see that I have spoken about 15 minutes. So let me stop here, and I'm very happy to hear comments or any questions that I'd be able to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Keshavarz, for this inspiring talk. I want to, let me look at the questions. So yes, we only have, we have 2 questions now from the same person. I will ask the first one first, by Zehra Sekiz Kardeş. She says, do we see in Rumi's work, if he has consulted the Islamic scripture, the Quran and the Hadith, as a form of intertextuality in his poems?
Absolutely. I think I sometimes say in class that you can imagine Rumi's poetry having been dipped in the Quran and sometimes the body of the Hadith. Now, again, they're full of echoes of the Quran. When you read something and you can see that, oh, he is now referring to the Quran being a remembrance. Now he's referring to the creation of Adam and, all various aspects. And sometimes he explains it and refers to more clearly, and sometimes he doesn't. It's just an allusion to these things and kind of elusive interpretation, both in the Quran and the tradition of Prophet. I think people sometimes assume that the Masnavi has more of it, because in the Masnavi, he speaks directly about these topics. So he does say, well, God Almighty said this or that. But in the body of the Ghazals, there is no reference, but it's still, you see the echo, the kind of more you could describe as intertextual more. It occurs in the lyric poetry. Absolutely.
Thank you. And I think that is maybe some of the things that in the beginning of your talk that you talked about, how sometimes Rumi is stripped of this Islamic his Islamic context, and maybe part of that.
Yes. Unfortunately, up to this day, I think there is. Of course, when you have these major figures like Rumi, like Shakespeare, like Dante, there'll always be a wide range of translations and a wide range of writings. At one end, it could be completely acontextual. At other end, it could be overly so focused on the context that you cannot see so much of the poetry itself. And so I think probably our attempts should not be to stop any translator from doing their kinds of translation or their kinds of interpretation, but to flood this arena with our own view of things and be sure that that would also be seen. But yes, absolutely, that is quite, particularly, I think it was around 9/11 that Coleman Barks took the word Huri out of that poem. He was probably too afraid of having anything there that associates Rumi with paradise and Huris, and you know.
Thank you. And we have another question from Betül Yavuz. She says, thank you for a wonderful presentation. Do you think you would have still become a poet if he had not met Shams?
Thank you for that question. Thank you for that question, because I did wonder, there's so much that you can say about him, including his encounter with Shams. So I'm delighted to answer that. First of all, Rumi wrote poetry way before he met Shams. And in fact, his poetic name was Khamush, silent, the silent one. And after meeting Shams, there was a surge there. There was a kind of shift from doing more analytical in a kind of discussions of, speculative mysticism to where you would have the affective, the musical, the touching the soul of the readers. So there's no doubt that the encounter with Shams encouraged that to happen further. But he did have this wonderful, poetic, and highly educated in literature, not just Persian, of Arabic as well. And as I said, quoting some Indian tradition. So yes, it encouraged him to take these things, but make them more poetic. Reason why we know that his poetry was a gift from before, and probably from the family and from his father and the tradition, is that as he speaks, that is collected in Fihi Mafi, he quotes these other poets. He quotes Anbari, and he quotes these poets who are not even necessarily all mystics, which shows that he actually knew their work. In fact, we have a quote, and I'm not sure how authentic that is, that Shams at some point told him he reads too much poetry. So whether that is actually true or not, I'm not sure. But I want to use also this occasion to see that important as Shams was in Rumi's life, sometimes his presence has been exaggerated, as if he just turned something that wasn't very much into everything. The way I would look at it is that he threw a pebble into the pond that already existed. You could see the overlapping circles of the water changing. He was a catalyst, but much of what Rumi had to do with his father, his family, his teacher, his studies. And in fact, Shams says, I haven't come for everyone. I've come for him. And I find people like him and Gosht Barrage Ishan Minaha. And I try to touch their lives because he is different. So I think that it's important to remember that, but not in an exaggerated way. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Özlem Ezer. How do you overcome the challenges of Orientalism or simply the lack of the Quranic knowledge in the US or global North when you teach?
Great question. First of all, there are some simple accessible books written that talk about Islam just like they talk about any other religion, about the, you know, the principles, about practiced Islam or living Islam, about its multiplicity, about, you know, go to Indonesia and you see a different Islam, go to China, you see a different Islam, go to Iran and Turkey and you see versions that are probably closer to each other, but still different. And so by showing that multiplicity, you can overcome the fear that the students have about the rigidity, by actually showing visual aspects of these different multiple Muslim societies or Muslim majority societies kind of overcomes that. Then we read selections from some of the, you know, Hadith literature, Quran literature, just so that they can actually have a taste of what it is. And that some of it they can agree with and some of it they can't, but so what? That's learning, that's what learning is about. And so we build that context so that when they reach to actually do the actual mystical literature, they can see the context. But I do a couple of other things as well. One is that I include some non-Muslim mystics. And Hildegard of Bingen, a woman in medieval Germany, and she is constantly in struggle against the church. She writes her own music, her own poetry, and her poetry and music are full of Christ. You know, and then so the students are like, well, is he against the church? Is she against the church or is she not against the church? So we have to overcome that black and white, that for or against, and the fact that you need the vocabulary in order to express ideas. That usually really helps them. I also remind them that if Rumi was not a Muslim, it wasn't a big deal for him to try to reform things. What actually makes it a big deal is that he does have that belief, and he still wants to better it, to understand it differently, to dismiss the interpretations that are wrong, and therefore he challenges it, hoping that that challenge would make other people's understanding better, but also his own understanding of things better. So it's a struggle, but it's a fun struggle. So,
thank you. And I want to continue with a question from Halim Kara. Have you read contemporary fiction on Rumi in Turkish and Persian? If so, can you see the perception of Rumi similar to the West in Turkish and Persian modern fiction?
Yes, I have, and it's actually become a very powerful tradition, both in Persian and Turkish. And, you know, it depends. Some authors are more familiar with history. There's a book that came out in Persian about Kimya Khatun, the adopted daughter of Rumi. And it just is, it was devastating for people to read it because it described Shams as an abusive person, and, you know, and I know the author. I like her very much as a person. She's in fact an amazing woman who has established a pediatrics center for treating cancer, children with cancer. So she's amazing, but she doesn't know history. So when when we were talking, it was like, well, where did you get this? And it was like, well, I was in Pakistan and I was talking to people and I saw this book, and, you know, so it's a notion of the way things were that is based on what you, depending on where you are and how you experience your life, you bring that interpretation to your work. In some instances, I will call that self-orientalizing. That's exactly the process that I described as self-orientalizing. But you know, I don't believe in forbidding anything. I don't believe in attacking anything. I think these different expressions have to come out, whether it's by Aleph Shafak or the, you know, the Iranian woman I referred to, or others. They have to be expressed, and there will be one in the multiple, you know, in the rainbow of the materials that have been dedicated to Rumi and to mysticism. I mean, Ibn Arabi has been subjected to the same thing, both on screen and in literature, and with different goals and ideas. You know, either presenting something in some practice in a certain way, or purely because you want to express your views, and that's how you understand to be the situation to be.
Thank you. We have another question from Derin Terzoğlu. She says, thank you very much for this very interesting talk. I wanted to ask about the ways in which he is read in contemporary Iran. Could you give us some sense of the range of responses to his poetry in contemporary Iran?
Yes, thank you for that question. That part of what I was absolutely shocked by, the English literary criticism of Rumi up until mid 20th century, calling him a poet who wrote things reluctantly, and he hated poetry and so on, was because I grew up in a culture that if you said name 4 major poets, one of them would be Molavi, you know, that beyond any doubt. And looking at manuscripts, existing manuscripts of his, not just Masnavi, but the Divan. In fact, if you said the Divan, if you said Divan or Divan-i Kabir in Persian, which means the major Divan, the collection of poems, everybody will understand to be Rumi's Divan. That term has been appropriated by him over centuries, not as a recent thing. So he's been a, to borrow an unpleasant term, and he has been a best-selling author in the Persian tradition and Persian-speaking traditions. You can say the same thing about Tajikistan. You can say the same thing about other Persian speakers elsewhere. He's a very popular poet. Now, there is a range of the way people will take him. There are those who are far more focused on his approach to religion, approach to mysticism. There are those who are interested in his Quranic quotations, or, you know, hadith quotations and so forth. There are those who see him as a poet of love and just want to read his lyric poetry. So it's really a multiple range. The other way in which we know how popular and important he was is that there's an equal number of commentary on the Masnavi and his poetry is written as are commentaries on the Quran itself. In fact, it's the expression Quran به زبان پهلوی or Quran Farsi, the Persian Quran, is referred to his work. So it's a range depending on your background, your education, your interests, but he is there, has been there very much, and I anticipate will be there. Sometimes they also Orientalize him, but you know, that's who we are as human beings with different perspectives, but he's present.
Thank you. We have another question from Saadet Demiroğlu. After 8 centuries and so many researches and explanations, how close are we to reach a level of understanding of Rumi? Is the question.
That is an amazing question. And I think I try in my, the chapter of that I have on his imagery, and I want to come back to question by way of addressing the imagery. There are, up until mid-20th century, these compendia of Sufi images and their interpretations. You know, the khal is the noqteh wahdat. The lips are sweetness of paradise. The face is the glow of God. The hair is multiplicity of experience. And they freeze this poetry with this kind of dictionary equivalence. He said, the moon, this is what it means here. You know, the moon is the beloved. Well, I try in that chapter to show that that is not the case at all. In fact, he breaks these images open. He says, می شدم در فنا چو مه بی پا این بی پا ی پا دوان که منم. I was journeying in nothingness, like the moon, footless like the moon. Here I am, a footless runner in your direction. So here the moon is the lover, not the beloved. And so what I do there, I try to show how changing, how diverse, but also dynamic. In fact, I use the phrase, these images have to be seen in action. Because in one poem, they mean something, in another, it could mean something else, and it's totally intentional. So what I'm saying there is that here I am reading this, and I'm going to offer you my understanding of these images. But what I believe is that there's going to be other interpretations time and again until we exist and we read poetry, because that's what makes Rumi different. There is room there for you to inhabit that poem and see it the way you can see it. Actually, the American poet Billy Collins has a beautiful poem called Introduction to Poetry, and he says that I want them to treat my poetry like a room, to come in, turn the switch on, maybe even throw a mouse in there and see how it runs around the corners of the room. And all they want to do is to tie this poem to a chair and beat it with a hose to understand what it means. So I think that forever people will walk into those poems, turn the light on, and come up with new interpretations. Now, of course, the interpretations that are informed by knowing his context, by knowing the literature he refers to, by understanding the generic conventions of the poem that they're reading, all of those are important. You can write an interpretation that's really not tied to anything, but you can also have interpretations that are highly informed, but they're not conforming, that you still open a window to something new and say more about it. So I think it's not a spot to get close to. It's a garden to run around. And so we will have that running around, I think, for time immemorial until we can.
Thank you. We have a question from Marian Shalal. Could you please say a few words about Sufism in relationship to Rumi?
Sufism.
Doctrine, I
Yes. Well, you know, of course, my husband is on this call and is the researcher on Sufism, so please excuse my speaking about something in which I'm not necessarily the expert. But I think to Sufism, the same thing has happened, that people have tried to capture it and say it consists of 7 different principles, talab and fana, and these markers of it's a journey from your small self to your bigger self, from yourself to God, depending on what you understand about the truth and your environment, you can interpret Sufism. But I would say Sufism is a range like this too. You can have Sufis who are not conforming with religion. You can find Sufis who are even literalists about interpreting religion. But if I were to, to my best of my ability, encapsulate it somewhere, I would say it is to enable your inner sacred self to speak and not let the cacophony of the noises around you to distract you from that inner being, be it the zikr that Rumi said God has put in you, being the positive energy, whatever you think of it. To me, my understanding of reading Sufi literature is that enabling you, first of all, to acknowledge that such a voice exists in you, and then to enable it to speak and to make a communication with that voice, and basically unsilence that in your life. Then, if you are a Sufi, a conforming Sufi, you will fast and pray. If you're less conforming, you may not do those practices. Again, as I said, there are just all kinds of ranges. It's a journey to discovering some truth, which, as the birds of Attar discovered, wasn't up on the mountains, it was in them. So sorry, it's a really large concept to fit in a few sentences. So I hope that was helpful.
We have another question from Melikan Kirazoğlu. To which extent did Rumi have knowledge of Ibn Arabi's metaphysics?
I think that he definitely was familiar with it. I think Ibn Arabi is for Rumi too much of a builder of mystical structures, where for him, he has a much more fluid, moving around, dancing around. And so I don't actually see a huge amount of sympathy or quotation, but I don't want to portray him as anti-Ibn Arabi by any means. I think they definitely have each had great impact on the world around them, and I'm absolutely sure that he was familiar with Ibn Arabi. And I actually, just thinking about it, I don't know that I have examples in the Masnavi that would make a direct reference to Ibn Arabi. If there's somebody on the call who knows, that would be lovely if they mention it. But of course, as you know, there's a story that they met, and there's even an article that, the mixing of the two oceans, and they came together, and I'm not sure how provable that is. And so my answer would be, I'm sure he's familiar with Ibn Arabi. I don't know that he would be. I mean, he's far more indebted to Attar and Sana'i, the other two Persian-speaking giants of mysticism. In fact, he says, Attar ruh budo, Sana'i do cheshme. Attar was the soul, and Sana'i was the two eyes. Ma as peye Sana'i o Attar amadi. I have come after Sana'i and Attar. So I don't know, does that mean he's the dancing body? Whatever it is, he acknowledges their presence in very clear and concrete way. I don't know that he does that about Ibn Arabi.
Thank you. We have two comments. I mean, questions keep coming, but I'm going to say the comments first. The first one is from Maryam Musawi. It's amazing how performative Rumi's language is. I appreciate that Professor Keshavarz highlighted this dialogic quality of Persian poetry. And then another one is Ken Westfall, who says, if I may be allowed an observation from a philosopher here today to listen and learn and to enjoy your marvelous cadence and intonation, as in philosophy, as in inquiry, so also in literature and especially poetry, answers are important, but the best answers are those which lead to the next discoveries. The point of imagery and simile is to provide the multiplicity which can both integrate and further our developments. Thank you for your kind presentation. And I want to continue with another question from Işıl Usal Kalveli. The poem you read about the form and meaning reminded me of Heart Sutra from Buddhism. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Was there a relationship between Rumi and Buddhism?
Well, we do know of Buddhist structures, around there, but I don't know that he has any direct references or anything that, there's so much overlap. The idea of nothingness and that the nothingness that he's walking on, or emptiness, the heat, the concept of heat and all that is so central to Attar and to him that one is tempted to think that there is more contact. So I would venture into saying that because of the intertextual presence of these ideas, I mean, if you're dealing with classical Persian and Arabic literature alone, and we'll not even go beyond that, there's such a vast body of literature that embodies so many human experiences and aspects of human learning that I am sure there is influence there. But I don't know that I can speak of direct reference, to direct influence in that sense.
Thank you. We have another question from Özkan Karabulut. You mentioned in your talk that during a funeral, Rumi took out musical instruments and began whirling, dancing, and reciting poems with his disciples. It sounds like in his time, the ritual of Sema was not happening only in dervish lodges and not formalized. I'm wondering if you could tell when Sema became a Levi ritual and practiced in Hanekas, and how this ritual acquired a specific choreography.
Okay, well, I think that is really my husband question, but what I can say is that during Rumi's time, it happened almost everywhere. It happened in Moinuddin's house, it happened in a mosque, it happened in Rumi's own, where he gave his talks, and I don't want to say sermons because sermons are so different because he kind of interacted with the audience around him. So I don't believe that for him, or at least him as reflected in historical sources of around his time and soon after, like, Aflaki is about 80 years after him, Sama can happen anywhere. As a matter of fact, they say that one of the famous episodes is that the first time he was in the goldsmith's market. And as they were working with hammers and chisels, and it makes just very musical sound, he started whirling. Whether these are historically accurate or not, they show that the activity, of course, Sama, as you know, the meaning is listening to music. So the hearing is very much the mother of all of this. But definitely the instances during his lifetime shows that it wasn't limited to a Khanaqah and could have happened in different places. What I can also say is that before his time, say Muhammad Ghazali, the famous theologian, you do have very specific adab and, trying to basically bring this activity under control and make it acceptable and happening in an environment in which great teachers are present, that certain practices are observed. And without being a scholar of Sufism and Sama, I think, speculate that at different historical times, depending on what is permissible in terms of practice, how much openness was available, that this practice would have moved outside and been more accessible than other times where they had to be much more careful about which parts of it were conforming and acceptable and which parts were.
Thank you. And we have a question from Burcu Uzun. What does Rumi's poetry tell us, especially the readers of the 21st century? How can we read it in the shadow of the 21st century?
Well, I'm hoping that the different aspects of his work that I lined up do show that he has relevance for our life, that he is open to change, that he sees human beings as agent enough to understand and interpret. Of course, there's none of these are unlimited freedoms, like you can just say anything without being informed or based on a source, but he does see humans as capable of interpretation, of a spiritual progress. He wants them to understand that he's really a person of communication. This whole focus on Sukhan, this complexity of Sukhan and its role in our life is about being a person who belongs to the world. I don't see his mysticism as, hide in a corner and, fast and pray. Maybe you do short periods of that to train yourself, but it's about living these values, these practices, part of which should open you up to other traditions. But I think what I would really highlight in Rumi is the sense of play. You have to play with life. There's another anecdote that Aflaki quotes, and that is there was a Christian who converted to Islam because of Maulana and became a good friend and was often with him. And at some point, Rumi turns to him and says, when you were a Christian, what did you say about Jesus? And of course, it's, I think, again, making it communication, because he obviously knows enough about Christianity. And the person, I don't remember his name, I think it's Borzu, or he says, we said Jesus is God. And Rumi, according to this anecdote, starts running around the yard and says, Muhammad ma Khuda tar, Muhammad ma Khuda tar. Our Muhammad is more God, our Muhammad is more God. So, obviously no Muslim believes that Muhammad is God. Obviously he is, what he's doing and what he's saying is that live with this, play with this, dance with this. Don't imprison it in a book that nobody can read and understand. And so I think that may be really a message to us, that this life is worth living, and these principles that he's bringing to us are worth playing with and living with.
Sorry, it's me.
Yes.
Forgot to unmute myself. Thank you. That was the end of our questions. If I may, I want to ask you one. In your book on Rumi, you talk about the concept of paradox and illogical tropes. Could you, and I speak about paradox in my Sufism class too, could you, and some of my students are here, could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I actually, just before I started writing the book, I had read an essay about John of the Cross and his interest in paradox. And you know, that really, that resonated with me, and I started to think about that. And then the very first kind of foundational thought that I had was that the life of a mystic is a paradox in itself. You're supposed to be up there united, and you're here living on earth the life that you have to live. And it's the tool that you were given. So you're living with this paradox. Now, with that in mind, I started looking into Rumi's poetry, and I found it so rich with paradox that it was actually the first chapter that I wrote. And I think it's hard to condense all of that, of course, in a few minutes conversation. But what happens in paradox is that when you hit this wall of impossibility, when you can no longer go through these ordinary roads open to you, it's only then that you can open up new ways. A whole new horizon can open before you. You give up being on that standard, accessible mode of thinking, then you begin to go through that. I also thought that, again, paradox is playful because you say something impossible, you bring two things together that cannot be together. And so you're playing with language because language gets resistant. You can't say, you know, black is white. And you immediately feel the resistance. And then, so I use that to bring to the attention of the reader how naturally he played with the possibility that comes after this impossibility of paradox. So not to be afraid of it, not to avoid it. You know, Michael Sells has a great book about, in a chapter about Ibn Arabi, about Meister Eckhart. And he says that because Meister Eckhart says that, God, I'm trying to remember the phrase, pray to God to be free of God. And that causes this tremendous shockwave, you know, pray to God to be free of God. And then Michael Sells says that people try to resolve the paradox by saying, okay, pray to God with capital G that you're free of God with small g. But that's not what he says. He says, pray to be free of everything, including naming God, the God. Because the moment you name it, you put some fences around him, her, it, whatever. And so pray to be free of that. But our reaction to paradox usually is finding a way to explain it away. And Rumi says, don't explain it away. پای استدلالیان چوبین بود. The legs of those who do istidlal is made of wood. Of course, he's istidlaling all the time himself. So is he saying my own leg is also chubin, or my bringing of conversation and istidlal different? No, he says both of these are happening at the same time. And be aware of that limit and unlimitedness. Only when they come together, things make new openings become possible.
Thank you very much for that answer. I think there are no more questions. And so thank you. I would like to thank you, Professor Keshavarz, for being with us so early in the day for you. And it was a great pleasure for me, and I'm sure for all of my colleagues and students here, our students and everyone else. Thank you for listening. Yes, we're honored to have you.
Ben çok teşekkür ederim. Çok memnunum. And it's a pleasure for me to be here and to speak to colleagues and students and friends here and elsewhere in the world. And thank you for the invitation.